Emily Larson thought her husband David was saving her life. Every morning he brought her breakfast in bed after she gave birth. But what she didn't know was that each spoonful of cereal carried the poison he'd chosen to end her life. Emily Larson had always believed her life was finally complete. The small white house on Cedar Lane, with its neat garden and blue shutters, was everything she had dreamed of. Her husband David had painted the nursery himself when they found out she was pregnant, and together they spent countless evenings imagining the sound of their baby's laughter filling the rooms. When their daughter, Lily, arrived on a bright spring morning, Emily thought she had reached the happiest moment of her life. What she didn't realize was that for David, that same day marked the beginning of a slow, dark unraveling. David had always been the kind of man who craved control. He liked order, schedules, and quiet. Emily, on the other hand, was gentle and spontaneous, filling the house with music and laughter. Their differences had never been a problem before the baby. But when Emily became a mother, her world revolved entirely around Lily. The late-night feedings, the constant exhaustion, and the endless cycle of crying and comforting left her with little time for anything else. David watched from the sidelines, feeling himself fade from her world. The woman who once greeted him at the door with a smile now barely noticed when he came home. The sound of Lily's cries replaced their conversations, and in those long, sleepless nights, something inside David began to curdle. At first it was only irritation. He told himself it was natural. Anyone would get frustrated being ignored. But irritation grew into resentment, and resentment soon turned to bitterness. Emily didn't see it. She thought he was just tired like her. Worn out from the adjustments of new parenthood, she trusted him completely, never suspecting how cold his thoughts had become. When he offered to take over breakfast duty so she could rest longer, she felt grateful. Every morning she would nurse Lily, hand the baby to David, and sit down to the cereal he had lovingly poured for her. It became a routine that made her feel cared for, even during the hardest weeks of postpartum life. To the outside world, the Larsons seemed picture perfect. Neighbors saw David mowing the lawn while Emily pushed Lily's stroller down the street. Friends brought gifts and congratulated them, admiring how easily they appeared to handle new parenthood. But no one noticed the tension hidden behind David's polite smiles. He spent more and more time alone in his study, staring at his computer, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't control. He began reading articles about poisons, dosage levels, and symptoms that mimicked natural illness. The idea had started as a dark fantasy, something unthinkable that gave him a twisted sense of power. Yet each night, when he lay beside Emily and heard the soft breathing of both his wife and daughter, the thought returned stronger than before. He convinced himself that Emily was the problem. She was too focused on the baby, too neglectful of him, too different from the woman he had married. Divorce would ruin him both financially and socially, but if something were to happen to her, something tragic and unforeseen, he could be free. The thought terrified him at first, but soon it began to feel logical. He imagined people comforting him, telling him how brave he was to raise a baby alone. He imagined sympathy instead of judgment. The fantasy consumed him until he no longer saw Emily as a person, only as a barrier between him and the life he thought he deserved. One morning, he stood in the kitchen before sunrise, staring at the cereal box on the counter. The faint hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. He ran his hand along the edge of the counter, steadying himself. Upstairs, Emily was still asleep, her breathing soft and uneven. He thought about how easily he could change everything. The first step would be small, just a little test, something that wouldn't raise suspicion. He poured the cereal, added milk, and carried the bowl upstairs with a smile on his face. When Emily thanked him and took the first bite, David felt something shift inside him. For the first time in months, he felt in control again, and that feeling, dark and satisfying, would soon drive him to cross a line from which there was no return. Emily began to notice something strange only a week after David started preparing her breakfast every morning. The fatigue she'd attributed to sleepless nights with Lily began to feel heavier, more unnatural. Her stomach ached constantly, waves of nausea came and went, and even simple tasks like standing up to feed the baby left her dizzy. She assumed it was just part of postpartum recovery. Everyone said the first months were the hardest. When David suggested she rest more and let him handle the meals, she accepted gratefully, unaware that her trust was slowly becoming her downfall. At first, her symptoms were mild, just fatigue and loss of appetite, but soon they grew unbearable. Emily's vision blurred, her skin turned pale, and she could barely hold Lily for more than a few minutes without trembling. She confided in David that she didn't feel like herself anymore, but he always reassured her it was nothing serious. He spoke gently, offering her a glass of water, encouraging her to eat the breakfast he'd made. To Emily, he looked like the perfect husband, patient, understanding, and caring. But behind that mask, David watched every wince, every cough with quiet fascination. His plan was working just as he had imagined. The poison he used was subtle, chosen after weeks of research. It was the kind that mimicked illness, causing nausea, weakness, and confusion, but rarely detected in small doses. He added it to her cereal with precision. Never too much, just enough to keep her sick but alive. Each morning he stirred the flakes slowly, blending the milk, making sure nothing seemed out of place. Sometimes he even tasted a spoonful himself, spitting it out quietly in the sink afterward, all to maintain the illusion of care. He told himself this was mercy, that he was easing her out of her misery rather than inflicting pain. But deep down he relished the power it gave him, the control he had over her body and her fate. As the days passed, Emily's condition worsened. She stopped leaving the house altogether, too weak to walk beyond the nursery. Her mother offered to visit and help, but David insisted he had everything under control. He didn't want anyone near enough to notice the truth. Emily lay in bed, too exhausted to argue, watching him cradle Lily and smile at the baby. There was tenderness in his touch, but something about it began to unsettle her. He seemed too calm, too composed, as if nothing about her decline disturbed him. She brushed the thought aside, blaming her paranoia on the medication and sleepless nights. When she finally saw a doctor, the tests showed nothing conclusive. The results pointed to stress, malnutrition, maybe postpartum complications. David sat beside her during the appointments, nodding solemnly, pretending to be concerned. The doctors told her to eat well, rest, and rely on her husband for support. That was exactly what David wanted, to keep the suspicion away from himself while the poison continued to do its work. One afternoon, while feeding Lily, Emily felt an intense pain shoot through her stomach. The room spun around her and everything went dark. She woke up in the hospital hours later, confused and terrified. David stood at her bedside, holding her hand, his face pale with what looked like worry. The doctors couldn't explain her collapse. Her blood work showed minor abnormalities, but nothing that indicated foul play. They called it exhaustion and dehydration. David nodded and thanked them, hiding the small, satisfied flicker in his eyes. The hospital stay gave him time to think. He realized that killing her quickly would invite suspicion, but if she continued to weaken slowly, it would seem like a tragic medical mystery. He planned to increase the dosage once she returned home, but there was something he hadn't considered. The hospital nurse who noticed the confusion in his eyes when he spoke about Emily's illness. Her name was Karen, and she would become the reason his carefully constructed plan began to crumble. That night, as Emily drifted in and out of sleep, she dreamed of her husband feeding her cereal in the kitchen. His hands looked gentle, but his eyes were cold and empty. She woke up with a chill she couldn't explain. For the first time, a quiet fear settled inside her, a fear that the danger she felt wasn't from her sickness, but from the man sitting beside her bed. Nurse Karen Myers had worked at the hospital for 15 years, and she had seen almost everything: accidents, heartbreak, and quiet recoveries. But something about Emily Larson's case unsettled her. The young mother looked far too fragile for someone only a few weeks postpartum. Her symptoms didn't align neatly with any diagnosis Karen had seen before. The lab reports hinted at something toxic in her system, but the doctors brushed it off as a possible error. Still, Karen couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling that something about Emily's illness didn't make sense. Over the next few days, Karen paid close attention to every detail. She noticed that Emily's husband rarely left her side, always insisting on being the one to bring her food and drinks. Most husbands, in her experience, looked exhausted or anxious, but David's composure felt wrong. He smiled at the right times, spoke gently, and yet there was a cold distance behind his eyes. When Emily dozed off, Karen sometimes caught him staring at her with an expression that was impossible to read, something between calculation and satisfaction. She couldn't prove anything, but the feeling clung to her like a shadow. Karen quietly requested another round of tests. This time she made sure the samples were handled directly under her supervision. The results came back showing faint traces of a compound related to rodenticide. It wasn't enough to be lethal, but it was enough to raise questions. Karen brought the findings to the attending physician, who hesitated to accuse anyone without solid proof. They agreed to monitor Emily closely and suggested that she remain in the hospital for further observation. David didn't like that. He wanted her home where he could continue what he had started. When the doctor explained the decision, David forced a smile, masking his irritation. He told Emily it was just a precaution, that everything would be fine, but inside he was panicking. The longer Emily stayed in the hospital, the more he risked being discovered. That night he sat in the dimly lit hospital room, pretending to scroll through his phone while planning his next move. If anyone tested the food she ate at home, everything could fall apart. He decided that once she was discharged, he would dispose of anything that could tie him to the poison. Karen, however, had already started thinking ahead. She asked Emily's mother to bring in samples of what Emily had been eating recently, especially the cereal her husband served each morning. Emily's mother, worried and confused, went to the Larson house the following day. David was there, wiping down the kitchen counters and throwing things into the trash. She asked for the cereal box, and he hesitated for a moment too long before handing it to her. She noticed his hands trembling, his eyes darting nervously toward the trash can. Something about his behavior unsettled her deeply. Back at the hospital, Karen sealed the cereal box in a plastic bag and sent it to the lab for analysis. The results came back faster than anyone expected, and they confirmed her worst suspicion. The cereal contained poison. The concentration matched the compound previously found in Emily's blood. Karen immediately notified the authorities, and within hours, detectives were sent to question David. When they arrived, David tried to maintain his calm demeanor, insisting he had no idea how the poison could have gotten into the cereal. He suggested maybe a manufacturing issue or contamination from storage. But his story faltered when they asked about his recent purchases. A receipt found in the house showed he had bought a pest control product containing the same compound only a week before Emily's hospitalization. The detectives confiscated his phone and computer for further investigation. While all this unfolded, Emily remained unaware of the storm building around her. She was slowly regaining her strength, believing that the worst was behind her. Karen visited her that evening, holding her hand a little longer than usual. There was compassion in the nurse's eyes, but also something else, a silent warning. Karen didn't tell her what had been discovered just yet. She wanted the police to confirm everything first. Later that night, when David arrived at the hospital, he was met by two detectives waiting outside Emily's room. He froze, realizing too late that his carefully crafted plan had begun to unravel. His pulse quickened, but he forced another smile, pretending to be surprised when they asked to speak with him privately. For the first time in weeks, David felt fear creeping in, the same fear Emily had started feeling in her dreams. What he thought was a perfect crime was already slipping from his control, and there was no way to stop what was coming next. The detectives questioned David in a small room at the hospital, their tone calm but deliberate. They asked simple questions at first about Emily's health, their home life, the food she had been eating. David answered each one with practiced composure, but his confidence began to crack when they mentioned the poison found in the cereal box. He denied everything, insisting that someone must have tampered with it, perhaps during packaging or transport. His explanation sounded reasonable on the surface, but his trembling hands and darting eyes betrayed him. The detectives exchanged glances, knowing they were speaking to a man who was trying to hold together a collapsing story. Meanwhile, investigators searched the Larson home. They moved carefully through the kitchen, collecting every piece of food and cleaning supply. In the trash, they found an empty box of rat poison, the same brand identified in the toxicology report. A search of David's study revealed more. On his laptop, they discovered online searches that painted a chilling picture of intent. How to poison someone slowly? Can rat poison be detected in an autopsy? How to make illness look natural? The evidence was overwhelming, each click a silent confession of his plan. When confronted with these findings, David's confidence shattered completely. He tried to claim that he had been researching out of curiosity, that he was worried Emily might have been poisoned accidentally by something in their home. But the detectives had already connected the dots. The receipts showed he had purchased the poison only days before Emily's symptoms began. The cereal box, the search history, the life insurance policy, everything formed a chain of motive and opportunity too strong to ignore. Emily was still in the hospital when the officers arrived with a warrant for David's arrest. She had no idea what was unfolding until she saw two uniformed officers waiting outside her door. When they stepped aside, she saw David being escorted down the hallway in handcuffs. For a long moment she couldn't move or speak. The man walking past her had been her husband, the father of her child, the person she trusted most in the world. Now he was a stranger, his face expressionless, his eyes fixed on the floor. The reality of betrayal hit her like a physical blow. The following days blurred together. Detectives visited her repeatedly, asking about their marriage, about his behavior in the weeks after Lily's birth. Each question felt like peeling back a layer of her life, revealing moments she had overlooked. His sudden coldness, his insistence on controlling her meals, his strange calm when she fell ill. The signs had been there all along, but love had blinded her to them. She couldn't stop wondering how long he had planned it, how many mornings he had stood in the kitchen pretending to care while quietly plotting her death. The news spread quickly once the story broke. Neighbors who once admired the Larsons as the perfect suburban couple were stunned. Reporters gathered outside their quiet street, and the house that had once symbolized new beginnings now stood as a monument to deceit. Friends reached out to Emily, offering sympathy and shock, but none of it made sense to her. The memories of their life together, holidays, laughter, shared dreams, now felt poisoned too. David's arrest brought a strange mix of relief and devastation. She was safe, but the price of that safety was unbearable. Late at night, when Lily cried in her crib, Emily sat beside her, struggling to reconcile the two versions of the man she had loved. She remembered how gentle he had seemed when holding their daughter, how tender his voice was when he spoke to her. That tenderness, she realized, had been a disguise. The detectives assured her the evidence would secure a conviction. They promised justice, but justice felt hollow. Nothing could undo what had been done. As the investigation deepened, more disturbing details surfaced. David had updated his wife's life insurance policy shortly after the baby's birth, naming himself the sole beneficiary. The motive was simple: money and freedom. He wanted to start over without the responsibilities of family life. Emily gave her statement in a quiet hospital room, her voice steady but empty. She didn't cry anymore. Something inside her had gone numb. When the officers left, she looked out the window at the fading daylight. The streets outside were calm, ordinary, as if the world hadn't just collapsed around her. Somewhere in the distance she could hear children playing, their laughter carried on the wind. It felt cruel that life could sound so normal when hers had been destroyed. She turned away from the window and held her daughter close, promising herself that Lily would grow up knowing the truth, not just about her father's cruelty, but about her mother's strength to survive it. David Larson's trial became one of the most talked about cases in Illinois that year. Reporters filled the courtroom every day, cameras flashing as the man once described as a devoted husband sat silently behind the defense table. His suit was neatly pressed, his expression blank, but his eyes darted nervously whenever the prosecution displayed evidence. The cereal box, the poison purchase receipt, and the screenshots of his search history painted a clear and horrifying picture. The story was no longer just about a husband's betrayal. It was about the quiet evil that can grow behind the walls of a seemingly perfect home. Emily attended the hearings, though each one felt like reopening a wound. Sitting in the courtroom, she listened to the details of her own near-death experience as if they belonged to someone else. The prosecutor spoke calmly but powerfully, describing how David had taken advantage of her vulnerability after childbirth, feeding her poison while pretending to care. The words made her stomach twist, but she forced herself to listen. She needed to hear every detail, to understand how close she had come to dying at the hands of the man she once loved. The defense tried to build their case around mental instability. They painted David as a man pushed to emotional collapse by the pressures of new fatherhood, claiming he acted out of a breakdown rather than cruelty. But the evidence was too deliberate, too organized. The jury saw the pattern, his lies, his searches, his calm behavior while Emily suffered. It wasn't madness. It was calculation. When it came time for David to testify, he finally broke his silence. His words were measured, rehearsed. He said he didn't remember buying the poison, that he might have used it for a rodent problem and forgotten. He claimed he loved Emily and would never hurt her. But as he spoke, his voice lacked conviction. The jurors watched him carefully, and even without emotion, his guilt seeped through every denial. Emily couldn't bring herself to look at him for most of the trial. The image of him in handcuffs haunted her. She had spent years believing he was the man who would protect her from harm, not cause it. When she did glance at him, she no longer saw the husband she once trusted. She saw only a stranger who had worn a familiar face. After weeks of testimony and evidence, the jury reached its verdict. The courtroom was silent when the foreperson stood. Guilty of attempted murder, assault, and endangerment. David stared ahead without expression, his jaw tightening slightly as the words sank in. Emily felt no triumph, no satisfaction. There was only emptiness. Justice had been served, but it could not erase the horror of what had happened. In the months that followed, Emily tried to rebuild her life. She moved out of the house on Cedar Lane, unable to bear its memories. Every room reminded her of betrayal: the kitchen where he had stirred her cereal, the nursery where she had nearly fainted, the bed where she had once felt safe beside him. She and Lily started over in a small apartment on the other side of town. The walls were bare, the furniture simple, but it felt peaceful. For the first time, silence no longer frightened her. The media followed her for a while, eager for interviews and updates. She turned them all down, wanting only to protect her daughter from the shadows of the past. But the story refused to fade. True crime channels and documentaries picked it apart, calling it the cereal poisoning case or breakfast betrayal. People speculated about David's motives, debating whether it was greed, resentment, or something darker. For Emily, the motive didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that she had survived. On the anniversary of David's sentencing, Emily took Lily to the park. The sky was clear, the air warm, and the sound of children playing filled the space around them. She watched her daughter chase butterflies through the grass, laughing freely, untouched by the darkness that had almost taken her mother away. For a moment, Emily closed her eyes and breathed deeply. She realized that survival wasn't just about living through something. It was about learning to live again after the fear had passed. Before leaving the park, she glanced at her phone. A message had arrived from a journalist asking if she wanted to share her story for a new documentary. She hesitated, then deleted it without replying. Some stories, she thought, didn't need to be told again. Some were already written in scars and silence. She picked up Lily, holding her close as the sun began to set, and whispered a quiet promise to never let the darkness that nearly destroyed them define the rest of their lives.